Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Charles Stang. I have the pleasure of serving as the director here of the Center for the Study of World Religions. And welcome to those of you who are new to our space to our regular Monday research talks. We are delighted to have Stuart Sarbacker as today's lecturer. Stuart is a visiting scholar this entire semester. So if you are interested in this work, as I imagine you all are, by virtue of your being here, you might connect with Stuart over the course of his time. He's here with us through the end of May.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So Stuart Sarbacker is a professor of comparative religion and Indian philosophy at Oregon State University. His work examines the relationships amongst and philosophical traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, particularly mind-body discipline or yoga. He addresses methodological and theoretical issues of religion, focusing on religious experience and its interpretation. He's conducted field work in India, Nepal, Thailand, and Japan. And prior to his position at Oregon State University, he was a senior lecturer at Northwestern University, where he received the Weinberg College of Liberal Arts Alumni Teaching Award for distinguished undergraduate teaching. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sarbacker. Stuart.
Yes. All right, I'm going to start my tech here. Give me just a second. So thank you so much all for coming, and it's a real pleasure to be here and an honor. The Center for the Study of World Religions is perhaps one of the foremost, if not the foremost institution for public-facing scholarship in the comparative and historical study of religion. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I want to thank Charles Stang and the staff of CSWR for all of their support, as well as some of my interlocutors, including Jeff Bro and Paul Gillis-Smith. It's really been an extraordinary experience so far in being here, and it's really accelerated the process of my research in many different ways. So before I jump into my talk, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the historical moment we're facing and the need for us all to be attentive and engaged with what's happening in the world right now. I think psychedelics as a subject and as a practice can be sometimes maybe a flight from the world. And I think more than anything, we need attention and care towards addressing the kinds of problems we face in the contemporary world. Actually, I wrote this essay several years ago now for the San Francisco Chronicle, sort of channeling Marshall McLuhan and kind of turning Leary's famous phrase a bit to think about the ways in which the study of psychedelics might in fact help us engage with the world in more deep and profound ways. I'm not sure if the shadowy figure at the bottom is supposed to be me, but in any case, I want to kind of start this talk with that spirit, acknowledging that we are at war and that we are facing numerous challenges, including climate change, etc. So, down of what I hope to establish over the course of this talk. I'm going to move this bar out of the way if I can. So first, that psychoactive substances have a lot of Indian asceticism. This role can be obscured by a singular search for so-called classical psychedelics. That it is more, in fact, effective to see Indian mind-body discipline as having a dynamic relationship with a range of exogenous or external substances that support, emulate, amplify, or symbolize endogenous practices and processes while reflecting yoga's shifting philosophical and cultural context. This provides insight, I would argue, into the deep influence of yoga on modern and contemporary psychedelic culture and vice versa, whether spiritual, recreational, therapeutic, or enhancement related. And so I'm starting the first slide with an image of Vaisajya Guru, or the Medicine Buddha. who holds in his right hand the amalaka or myrobalan plant, which symbolizes the sort of the deathless quality of the Buddhist teaching, the way it can liberate a person, but also a commitment to healing not only the mind, but also the body. So the background to this project really started in 2019 when I attended a biohacking summit or consciousness hacking summit called the Awakened Futures Summit. One of the things I was struck with in attending this was how biohackers were combining these technological resources with meditation and psychedelics, effectively stacking them as biohackers do to create a kind of synergistic effect to try to transform themselves through the use of these various means. I was also struck by how these communities of biohackers resembled the yoga communities I worked with. You'd have guru figures who would be the hub of small sort of mini communities of practitioners focused on particular practices or substances. At the center here, you have Mikey Siegel, who is a former robotics engineer, MIT trained, who is one of the key figures within the consciousness hacking community. Well, I mean things like combining not only psychedelics, but nootropics, nutraceuticals, the practice of fasting, aerobic conditioning, cold plunges or ice baths. Actually, I just found out there's a cold plunge over here next to Aeronaut Brewing Company the other day. The practice of postural yoga, meditation and mindfulness, as well as various technological prosthetics. And so my question became, were the Indian yogis, in fact, some of the original biohackers? And on the right here, we have a picture of a person who's become a kind of patron saint of the biohacking community. Does anyone know who that is? Wim Hof, of course. Nootropics means something like smart drugs, drugs that don't necessarily cause you to have a trip or a journey, but enhance mental function in some capacity. So like modafinil, for example, which is a very powerful stimulant or it could be other herbal substances as well. So following this sort of aha moment, eureka moment, I decided one thing I was going to do is climb onto this wave that was building in Oregon, and in particular, go through psychedelic facilitator training and kind of look at that through the lens of being a scholar, but also kind of see what it looks like from a boots on the ground practitioner perspective. That led to many insights into the role that not only yoga and meditation, but also religion in general figures into these communities. And we can absolutely talk more about that later. The other part was returning to my previous project called Tracing the Path of Yoga, which looked at the kind of larger arc of the history and philosophy of yoga. Thinking about things like what are the roles that different elixirs like Soma or Amrita or Rasa or Dravya are playing within yoga and tantra. What sorts of herbs, oshadi, or medicines or drugs, oshadi is a term that is derived from oshadi. So it's sort of when you apply the herb to a particular context, it turns into a kind of medicine or perhaps even a drug. What combinations are being referenced? How does the data appear if you conceive of this as a kind of stacking process in terms of principles like set, setting, and substance? And so what I mean by that is within the contemporary context of psychedelic studies, one of the most sort of important concepts I think that's pervaded the discourse is the idea of set and setting, often associated with Timothy Leary, but also connected to the work of Betty Eisler and others. Ido Hartogson does a great job of sort of teasing out the different dimensions of this and the ways in which it really gets at the idea that a drug in and of itself has a certain causal profile. But when you plug that into both internal conditions and external conditions, it transforms that process. And like Hartogson, I would think it makes sense not only to look at psychedelics through this lens, but really all drugs. and the different ways that different drugs interact both with set and setting. So with respect to set, we might talk about one's mental emotional state, memories, or things like the existence of trauma, expectations and intentions. That's a big part of facilitator training, especially the sort of pre-journey phase where you're helping people think about, what are they really trying to accomplish through taking a psychedelic journey? Mental training, your physical state. And then in terms of setting, physical environment, social environment, cultural environment, but also things like the ritual and practical environment. And here we might talk about the ways in which setting really has really deep roots in contexts like indigenous traditions, where you have whole ritual frameworks that provide a context, ritually speaking, for the process of taking some sort of plant or other substance. Last but not least, and this is one of the most important parts, I think, of my project here, is substance. And so expanding beyond set and setting to say things like whether it's a plant or a synthetic drug, whether it's got additives or it's mixed with other things, or whether multiple plants are mixed together. What is the amount? What is the dose? What is the frequency in which they're consumed? What is the method and mode of delivery? And one of the things I'm finding looking at the Indian context is, not only are people smoking things, right? That comes into the picture really late, but they're eating them, or they're placing them on their skin or in their eyes, or even in their rear ends in order to get an effect. So that matters, as well as things like the stage of delivery. The experience isn't always the same at the beginning as it is at the middle or at the end. So bringing that kind of complexity to thinking about the way that different psychoactive substances may be utilized, I think really opens up a wider vista of possibilities. So here I put this note at the end. Zinberg argues for drug set and setting in a piece in 1994. And I'm also, to some extent, building on the work of Matthew Clark, who emphasizes the ways in which multi-plant formulas mean that you have potentiation. One plant may potentiate another. They may have synergistic effects, and they may have different pharmacokinetics. They may affect the body in different ways. So these are all, I think, very important considerations. So let's turn, though, to South Asia. And I want to look first at some of the early material, the Vedic and Upanishadic context, and in particular, Soma and Visha. So the Vedic tradition, or early Hinduism, roughly 1500 to 500 BCE, is one of the kind of clear-cut cases where Indologists often start when they want to talk about the use of psychoactive substances in the Indic context. In part because Brahmanas or priests during this era performed yajna or sacrifices using oblations, homa, along with mantra performance while drinking a plant extract called Soma that seems to have amplified the effect of the ritual. So a couple of examples from the Vedas themselves, from the Rig Veda, the earliest of the Veda here. Apama, Somam, Amrita, Abhuma, Ganma, Jyotir, Avidama, Devan. We have drank Soma and have become immortal, Amrita. We have gone to the light and we have met the gods. Or we implore you who make wide space for ardent exhilaration. To you belong great songs of praise. For us, O drop, while seeking Indra, purify yourself in a stream of honey like a rain-bearing cloud. O drop, you are cow-winning, man-winning, horse-winning, and prize-winning. You are the ancient embodiment of the sacrifice. So very powerful examples of the ways in which Soma was conceived of as eliciting a particular type of religious experience, but also this idea that Soma itself is the essence of the ritual. And this is a theme we're going to return to again and again over the course of this talk. So many of us have probably, though, come to the discussion about Soma through the work of Gordon Wasson, whose book Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, appeared in 1968 at the height of the 1960s countercultural movement, in which he argued that Soma was perhaps Amanita muscaria, a famous mushroom that grows throughout the world, and I think he wanted to suggest was behind not only Indic religious life, but a broader scope in Europe and Asia. He was also, though, joined by Wendy Doniger in this publication, who talked about and emphasized the notion of Soma as being the essence of the sacrifice, but also suggesting the possibility that Soma was a precursor for yoga, that yoga was developed as a way to compensate for Soma's disappearance from Vedic tradition and culture. Now, I think they are both very interesting theories, but I think actually there's a more subtle way to look at this. In fact, over the course of time, many different substances have been proposed as Soma, including ephedra, Syrian rue, cannabis, poppy, mead, wine, ergot, Amanita muscaria as per Wasson, psilocybe cubensis, and even a ayahuasca analog. That's been proposed recently by Clark, but also appears in Leonti and Kasu will touch on later. So there are many different possibilities according to scholars, though I would say the consensus has largely been around ephedra. And I largely agree with that assertion. And though I'm open to the possibility of other candidates ultimately coming to the fore. Part of the reason I think ephedra, though, is such a good option is because if we think of Soma as a kind of stack, again, stacking these different effects together, it starts to make sense. So we have a set of priestly goals of health, wealth, sons, and immortality, gain and protection, but also preparation through austerities, tapas, self-restraint, including breath control, celibacy, and fasting. In the setting, we have a highly formulaic fire sacrifice amongst a community utilizing the entrainment of mantra. And for those of you who haven't had the experience, there are a few lingering communities of Vaidika Brahmins who practice the Vedic tradition. And when they perform mantras together, there's a powerful entrainment that happens. You really almost have to be there first person to fully experience it. Recordings somehow don't capture that effect. And I think that's a very powerful and important part of why these rituals are so transformative. Those mantras are performed over a significant time overnight, requiring alertness. And this is in part the argument Folk makes for ephedra, is that basically these Brahmins were doing these long protracted rituals and drinking ephedra over the course of the night, for example. Actually, one famous Soma ritual has 3 separate drinking phases. So one would imagine an arc of consumption and performance. Last but not least, the substance is extracted or pressed. Soma literally means that which is pressed from very specific sources or regions, which is mixed with milk, yogurt, and honey and drunk in stages, in some cases along with eating cakes called puro dashas. And there, again, we see you combine it with these other substances, which may potentiate parts of it and at the same time extend the effect of it. And so what I'm trying to argue here is that this is kind of like an orchestra of different functions and features that come together. So one doesn't necessarily need a potent, say, hallucinogenic substance to create exhilaration when you've got this whole ritual apparatus working together in concert with the ephedra to create these different types of effects. I should also say, if we want to see Soma in its relationship to yoga, we already see many of the features of yoga here. Mind-body discipline, visionary experience, the idea of an essence of spiritual practice as Soma, Amrita, or Madhu, meaning honey or the sweet one. The idea that the sacrifice is embodied in the herbs or in the rasas, the juices. These are concepts that come to fruition in some respects in the Upanishads, where the ultimate reality is talked about in terms of a rasa or an amrita that one discovers deep within oneself through a kind of process of introverted meditation. So, um, so, so this is one case. What often goes unnoticed, however, is there's another very famous hymn towards the end of the Rig Veda featuring the Cation or long-haired one. So let me just read this passage. The long-haired one bears fire, the long-haired one poison, the long-haired one the two world halves. The long-haired one bears the sun for all to see. The long-haired one is called the light here. He flies through the mid-space, gazing on all forms. The ascetic has been established as the comrade of every god for good action, ranging in the range of the apsarasas and gandharvas of the wild birds. The long-haired one is their sweet, most exhilarating comrade. Who knows their will? Vayu churned it for him. Kunanama kept crushing it when the long-haired one drank of the poison in his cup together with Rudra. So here we have a visionary sort of experience that's connected with the drinking of a visha or some sort of poisonous substance, which appears to have been churned carefully in a kind of admixture. One of the most important parts of this for my reading is the word for churned here is upamantat, which connects to a larger trope that extends throughout the Indian tradition of churning, of making a kind of potion through churning things. But also later narratives which involve the gods and the asuras, or the devas and the asuras, churning the cosmic ocean out of which comes the nectar of immortality. And then very importantly, the role of Shiva, who in the Vedic context is referred to as Rudra, who drinks a poison or visha that emerges out of the ocean. So we have a kind of basic foundational encoding of the idea of an ascetic practitioner who's consuming some sort of poison-like substance and journeying. And so one option that I'm sort of considered for this is Indian aconite, which is a very poisonous herb, which appears later on as Mahavisho, as the great poison, which comes into a sort of bent and very tough root, which sort of might connect to the word kunanama here, which means the inflexible one. But that somehow there was a mixing of this, what would otherwise be poisonous substance, and a drinking of it in order to elicit some exhilarating experience. And again, here we can say we already see some of the proto-yoga features of asceticism and the idea of visionary experience and even achievement of powers like reading others' minds within the domain of asceticism and yoga. And so this connection here is then both practical in the sense of the building blocks of later yoga practices and traditions, but also conceptual in thinking about terms like amrita and visha as not only physical substances, but referring to spiritual processes. So later, for example, yogis and Shiva in particular, as the Lord of yogis, is seen as being able to eat poison and convert it into amrita, into a kind of immortal substance. So there's a lot going on here in terms of both the practical and symbolic relationship between these substances and yoga. Well, let's turn to kind of the next phase here of the development of these concepts, or another phase, which is the later classical context, where you start to see the traditions of asceticism and yoga be systematized into formal yoga systems. And so perhaps one of the greatest examples, explicit examples of the use of substances to engender some sort of yogic experience happens within the most authoritative representation of yoga philosophy in India, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, or the Yoga Sutra Patanjali, in which he frames yoga in terms of an 8-limbed system. We can talk more about that later. But in the first verse of the fourth pada or section of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali states, Janma Oshadi Mantra Tapaha Samadhi Jaha Siddhayaha, that accomplishments or siddhis, extraordinary powers of action and perception, arise from birth, herbals or oshadi, incantation or mantra, austerity, tapas, and contemplation or samadhi. I like to joke, these are all kind of complementary in some respects. Within Ashtanga yoga, tapas, mantra, and samadhi all appear within the context of different limbs of yoga. One comparison is sort of if you're at Harvard, right? It's probably some combination of janma, of birth. You were born into the right circumstances. You may have worked really hard and committed various austerities. You probably have a good ability to concentrate your mind. For example, I'm not so sure about Oshadi, but one could say there's certain substances that are very helpful academically, as I think many of us are aware. Well, within the context of Patanjali, there's a number of really interesting things to go into here. And I'm going to struggle here to not go too in depth because I want to get through more material here. But in the commentary, Vyasa, the commentator, states Oshadi are equivalent to rasayana, which is an emerging category within Indian medicine or Ayurveda, which sometimes is translated as invigorant. That there are certain substances or combinations of substances which yield things like vitality and virility, as well as extraordinary powers, like being able to fly or to read other people's minds or to withstand all sorts of physical obstacles, let's say. Vyasa says these can be found in the Asura Bhavanas, the realms of the demigods or Asuras, which in yogic cosmology are underworlds called patalas, one of the most famous being the rasa tala, the tala where the rasas, where these special formulas are created. Interestingly enough, not only are these patalas the homes of the Asuras, but also of Nagas, who are in Indian tradition very profoundly associated with things like occult knowledge, finding secret teachings, gems, as well as things like rasas or rasayanas. Patanjali himself is portrayed in Indian narrative traditions as being a Naga who has taken on human form. So there's an interesting connection. Now, not to go too far into this, but one interpretation of this would be that these are occult substances that are perhaps found outside the perimeter of ordinary society, maybe among tribal groups, for example, forest dwellers, etc. Naga not only can mean serpent, but it can mean a particular group of tribal peoples. So there may be some suggestion here that outside the bounds of sort of conventional Vedic society were communities that had this sort of special knowledge that if one were willing to take the risk to travel to these realms, one might in fact find these sort of special potions and beverages that could accelerate one's spiritual development. One of the other commentators, the person I call Pseudo Shankara, because it's attributed to Shankara, but I don't think it's him, emphasizes Soma as a particular substance, as well as Amalaka, we encountered earlier, myrobalan, as two examples of substances that can produce these sort of city-like experiences. In addition, Patanjali goes on to say that not only powers arising from Oshadi, but from all of these sources can be connected to an idea called the nirmana chitta. The idea that when you take this substance, you temporarily have a constructed state of mind. And that mind has particular qualities, it has a certain duration. And during it, the ordinary sort of mode of existence is suspended, and one has some sort of extraordinary set of powers. Interestingly enough, the word psychedelic literally means mind manifesting. And it's a strange coincidence that these two terms mean something quite similar. But what I want to take away from this is that there are multiple modalities. You have complementarity and potentiation, a kind of stacking of different practices and substances. You have various formulas such as rasayana and soma. In fact, a 6th century manuscript includes a range of different herbs in a soma recipe, some of which appear to contain DMT, an MAOI inhibitor, and others. In fact, the authors of that particular study want to suggest that perhaps at least one version of Soma is a kind of ayahuasca analog. So we do have some representation, let's say, in the Indic Sanskritic tradition of cases where we have these substances being combined. Well, I should mention, at least in passing, that that passage in Patanjali is virtually identical to a passage that appears in the Abhidharmakosha Bhashya of Vasubandhu, one of the most important works of Indian Buddhist philosophy. In the Abhidharmakosha Karika, the verse states, Riddhi mantra aushadhibhyam cha karmaja cheti panchadaha. So Riddhi, or supernormal powers, are fivefold in origination via mantra and oshadi, as well as arisen from karma. And so there's a parallelism which really hints at the idea that this was not just an idea within the yoga context, but this was a kind of a widespread idea that there were these various sources of Riddhi, one of which was oshadi, was the use of particular herbs. Now, on the flip side, as I was saying before, we could talk about the practical, but also the symbolic. Around this time, you also see the arising of the notion that enlightened beings, whether it be a Jain Tirthankara, or it's a being like the Baisaja Guru, the medicine guru, that they become a kind of vehicle from which Aushadhi powers emerge. So in the case of the Jain Tirthankara, the effluents of the body themselves are seen as charged, very powerful medicines that one can consume. And in the case of the medicine Buddha, the idea that the teachings themselves have a kind of healing power, both in terms of mind and body. And I think especially the idea that if you deal with the core spiritual illness of the human condition, the poisons of attachment, aversion, and hatred, or I should say aversion, attachment, and delusion, ultimately you solve not only the spiritual problems, but you solve the physical problems at the same time. So there's a kind of spinning then of that practical domain into the spiritual domain. So let's shift gears again here and look instead now at the medieval context and see where the transformations happen again with respect to Oshadi and these concepts like Soma, Rasa, and Dravya. And so I'm going to focus on Ayurveda, Tantra, and Hatha Yoga, and some particular substances, including cannabis and datura. So cannabis arrives in India, it appears as a mode of practice relatively late. It used to be thought that cannabis appeared in the Vedas and in early Ayurvedic tradition, but increasingly that's being thought to be a mistake. And there are a number of reasons for that, and we can talk about that during discussion if you'd like. But what's clear is that cannabis appears in Ayurvedic texts by at least the 11th century. And terms include Bhanga, which means the breaker of bonds or fetters, Vijaya, which means the victorious one, Ganja, which means the intoxicator, Indrashana, which means the food of Indra, and Tribhavana or Triloka Vijaya, which means the conqueror of the three worlds. Categories associated with cannabis include the idea of the Divya Oshadi, a divine herb. So this is just an Oshadi, right? This is a powerful divine herb. But also, cannabis appears in various rasayana, various, invigorants or elixirs, which are associated with Ayurveda. In terms of practice, typically cannabis is talked about in terms of these three preparations: the bhanga, the leaves, which are crushed and drank. So, for example, on the left, you see government bhang shops in India, where one can buy bhang prepared during religious festivals. And it's really kind of a popular part of certain Hindu festivals like Shivaratri, for example. But then also ganja, or the more concentrated buds and flowers of the plant, or charas, the resin, which is kind of distilled from the ganja. Now, Alexis Sanderson, one of the foremost scholars of Shaiva traditions, argues that sacramental spiritual intoxication probably came relatively late, the 14th or 15th century of the Common Era, with Sufis. And smoking the chillum, which is a very, very common practice among Indian sadhus, typically smoking a combination of ganja and tobacco, appears around the 18th century. Before that, largely cannabis was consumed orally, and we're going to talk about some formulas for that. Though it's had a mixed reception within the Indian traditions. And so in the contemporary context, for example, many sadhus, I would say a high percentage, probably 75% or more, smoke the chillum, especially in social situations. But there are some sadhus who preach against the use of chillum. So we're going to see an example of that later on. Interestingly enough, the Arab author al-Badri proposes that cannabis actually started in India, and it was the work of Iblis or Satan versus via a Bengali Sufi sheikh named Burartin. And thus you get the name Bang from Bangla, the Arabic name for Bangladesh, or I should say for Bengal. So you have a little bit of disagreement over which direction these things came. But one thing I want to emphasize here is that whether it's in terms of festival culture or traditions of renouncers, Indian sadhus who have given up the world in a kind of formal way, who are dead to their past lives, for both of them, for both spheres, let's say cannabis is a really important part of the picture. Well, interestingly enough, in some cases, cannabis is associated with this story that I mentioned earlier, the churning of the ocean, the Samudra Mantana, by the gods and the devas. And in one version of this story, Shiva drinks the Amrita, and in his excitement, drops fall from his mouth, and those drops hit the ground, and from that sprout the aushadhi of cannabis or vijaya. But very importantly, during this era, you see a kind of explosion of various multi-plant formulas, which include not only aushadhi, but in some cases in the Ayurvedic context, metals such as mercury being used for aphrodisiacal, rejuvenative, and spiritual effects, often purified, shodaka, through an elaborate process, and then empowered by a mantra. And again, we can see examples of variations of Soma, for example, within the Bauer manuscript. So here's a great example in the Ananda Kanda, a Ayurvedic text that extensively addresses practices of yoga, talks about a formula for meditative support that involves making a karsha or bolus pill, a kind of big wad that one consumes with trijata, a series of spices, trikatu, including pepper and ginger, cumin, and cannabis. And so one would create this sort of wad out of it and consume it as a way to enhance one's meditative practice. And that notion actually carries down through much of contemporary sadhu culture. In fact, I read a study of sadhus in Nepal where some 75% smoked a chillum, in part because they said it aided in the practice of meditation by calming down thinking and preparing the mind for a kind of more sacramental state of being. Cannabis and many of these other components are considered either heating or cooling. And in Hatha Yoga, there's a notion that cannabis in its heating element helps reduce the sexual impulse or even dissolve the bindu, the sort of essence of one's sort of sexual impulses, and thus reaffirms their ascetic renouncer kind of ethos. And the interesting thing about that is, on one level, in some cases, you see cannabis represented as an aphrodisiac and others as supporting renunciation. And one way to explain that is to say occasional cannabis use may, in fact, cause a kind of aphrodisiacal response, whereas chronic use of cannabis will actually especially among men, reduce testosterone and even lead ultimately to sexual dysfunction. And so there's a kind of way you can argue, I think, scientifically, biologically, that that argument makes sense. And so, so last but not least, an important point here. One of the things I want to argue here is that cannabis and other plants may be serving not necessarily in all of these cases as psychedelic sort of agents, but also as nootropic or adaptogenic. In other words, they may be seen as supporting the practice of meditation, for example, or the practice of renunciation, enhancing in a nootropic way one's ability to concentrate more so than necessarily evoking visionary experiences. I think there are some recipes that suggest a dosage high enough to perhaps yield a psychedelic experience. At the same time, I think we should acknowledge that not all of this is really trying to evoke a psychedelic experience, but maybe more modulating physical and emotional states in a particular way that's considered valuable in practice. Well, let's look at a couple of more examples here. So in the Ananda Khanda, it states, Vijaya or cannabis is sought by perfected adepts, sages, women, yogis of all classes, by children, the elderly, the sick, eunuchs, and those with many wives. So cannabis has this ability to help in all sorts of different circumstances and connections. It's called Shiva's roots. It is the victorious. It is the breaker. It is the intoxicator. It's divine. It is a root of perfection. It's the essence of honey. It's the destroyer of fetters to the world. And so here we have another formula. Oh, let me see if I can get this guy out of the way. That contains Vijaya or cannabis, Unmata or datura, Vali, a twining creeper, Mundi, a thistle, Brahmi or hyssop, Kumari, Datri, Katudvayam, Sugandhika, Shaudra, and Gogrita. So again, a formulation of many different herbs, which may well have various synergistic effects, some of which have nootropic effects, Brahmi, for example, as well as datura. And my sort of suggestion here would be, much like you see in the context of some ayahuasca traditions, where datura is used as a potentiating agent, in this particular recipe, you're adding just a hint of datura to the cannabis mixture in order to have a more powerful, perhaps a kind of psychedelic or quasi-psychedelic effect. And that sort of potentiation, in part, I think, is a really sort of critical way that datura functions in the Indian kind of pharmacopoeia, let's say, as a way of making these things more powerful. So you might not see a sort of classical indole serotonergic psychedelic here, but one could imagine that potentiation creating psychedelic-like effects. Well, in Tantra, you have an embracing of a whole kind of variety of different substances. Perhaps the most famous examples being Madhya, Mamsa, Matsya, Mudra, and Maituna, or liquor, meat, fish, grain, and even sexual fluids as a means to accelerate spiritual transformation. I like to talk about Tantra as a kind of practice of ritual extension, through the use of mantra, through the use of ritual, through the use of bodily disciplines, and in some cases, transgressive practices. You aim to accelerate your spiritual development. And thus, it's a both very dangerous, but also very powerful practice from the viewpoint of its formulators. These rituals and substances unite the group of practitioners in very powerful and important ways. And so the clan or kula becomes extremely important in tantric context. Likewise, Shiva, who by now you recognize as a kind of common face to be found within this context, is featured as in wrathful forms like Bhairava, which is cognate with the Buddhist Vajra, Chakra Samvara, and other deities, who's a patron deity of Tantra, portrayed as a consumer of Vijaya and Datura, progenitor of the five M's and a counterpart to very fierce and powerful yogini deities. And so in tantric texts like the Matsyendra Samhita and the Khechari Vidya, which are formative of medieval Hatha Yoga, they praise cannabis in formulas for achieving power and longevity called Siddha Aushadhi. So power, the perfection, herbs of perfection. One text, Amaraga Prabodha, actually describes an Aushadhi-based samadhi. In other words, one can achieve samadhi either through meditative practice or through the use of certain herbs. Datura in general figures prominently, however, in aggressive magic. So what are called the Shatkarman or Shatkarmani, the six actions, especially Vashikarna subjugation. And this, I think, goes to the fact that datura historically is often served as a predatory drug in the way when you give it to someone, it can incapacitate them. However, not only is Shiva in some contexts talked about consuming it, but also some of the Mahasiddhas. And in addition, in the contemporary context, sometimes datura is used in a chillum to potentiate combinations of ganja and tobacco. So along with, from what I've read, but haven't encountered, the use of aconite, that very powerful poison I mentioned earlier, among Aghori, some of the more fearsome of the ascetic practitioners in India. So I see I'm behind time, so I'm going to skip a couple of quotations here. We can come back to them if you're interested, and just spend the last bit of time talking about how this plays out in terms of modern practice. So in Raja Yoga in 1896, Vivekananda, reflecting on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, states that yogis claim these powers can be gained by chemical means. In India, there was a sect called the Rasayanas. Their idea was that ideally, knowledge, spirituality, religion, which were all very right, but the body was the instrument by which to attain these. If the body could be made strong and perfect so that it would get rid of birth and death, we should have so much more time to become spiritual. Others believe that certain drugs could bring power, such as flying through the air, etc. I don't know if you get the sense, but that last statement seems a little bit dismissive, as if it's a bit of an afterthought. Though clearly we see the connection here between Vivekananda's understanding of yoga, its portrayal to a modern audience, both in terms of Rasayana and the achievement of these various powers. But his tone changes a bit when he talks about the experiments of Sir Humphrey Davy, who experimented extensively with nitrous oxide. He says, many of you remember the celebrated experiment of Sir Humphrey Davy when the laughing gas overpowered him. He said that the whole universe was made up of ideas. For the time being, as it were, the gross vibrations had ceased, and only the subtle vibrations, which he called the mind, were present to him. Even in the universe of thought, we find this unity. And at last, when we get to the self with a capital S, we know that self can only be one. These facts can no more be denied, as modern science has demonstrated them. That example serves as a sort of template for a kind of the shift in modern yoga from thinking about yoga in terms of a kind of metaphysical framework to thinking about it in a scientific framework. And to some extent, that second quote is much more validating than the first, because ultimately science can give us a kind of empirical window through the drugs like nitrous oxide to the eternal truths of the Vedantic tradition. And so if that's true of, say, the modern meditative yogic version, you see something very similar within modern postural yoga. So many of the modern, the formulators of modern postural yoga, like Swami Kuvalayananda, Bhavan Ropant, T. Krishnamacharya, and Sri Yogendra, sought to portray yoga as a kind of indigenous Indian physical culture during a period in time when physical culture movements were sweeping the globe. And as a result, they too sought to distance themselves from the kind of metaphysical considerations of pre-modern yoga traditions, as well as the use of substances like cannabis, for example. And so one way I think this ultimately comes to be expressed, for example, through Krishnamacharya's disciples Iyengar and Patabi Joyce, is an embrace of the drugs of modernity, coffee and tea. And on one level, I love this no coffee, no prana. So no coffee, no energy. And on one level, it's a bit amusing to think about the framing of coffee as a tool to help the lazy get over their laziness enough to practice yoga. But interestingly enough, one of the ways this is spun is the idea that there are these three basic characteristics of things: luminosity, kind of an energetic force called rajas, and a kind of torpor or tapas, which can characterize mental and physical life. Coffee is rajasic, so it's that jolt of energy you need to get up and get going. I've got a great story about that if you want to talk more about that during the Q&A. But the point here is that it's not like the use of psychoactive substances disappears. Again, it's a sort of a shifting of the cultural frame, what's valuable, what's acceptable, and really thinking about yoga within that modern frame means, to some extent, bridging over to those sorts of modern principles. But that's not to say that there's no consideration of the other stuff. And so in 1966, Iyengar writes, commenting on, again, Yoga Sutra 4.1, the verse on Oshadi I quoted earlier, followers of the first three, birth, Oshadi, and mantra, may fall from the grace of yoga through pride or negligence. So they are inferior ways to gain these extraordinary capacities. The others, whose spiritual gains are through tapas and samadhi, do not. Today, many drug users employ mescaline, LSD, hashish, heroin, etc., to experience the so-called spiritual visions investigated by Aldous Huxley and others. Artists and poets in the past have also relied on drugs to bring about supernormal states to enhance their art. And so here we have a modern yoga teacher reflecting on the sort of state of affairs as psychedelic culture is starting to emerge and kind of situating himself relative to it using this yoga philosophy. Now, it's interesting to note that Huxley himself was a follower of Swami Prabhavananda, a very important figure in the spread of Vedanta in the United States. And likewise, Huxley's influence is profoundly evident in Leary, Alpert, and Metzner's The Psychedelic Experience, a kind of landmark text in trying to provide a framework for psychedelic experiences, in this case, inspired by the Tibetan Book of the Dead or Bardo Thodol. And as we all know, Leary and Alpert went on to have lives as yoga-inspired gurus themselves in ways. And I love these two pictures at the bottom in particular, which capture that transformation from the straight-laced scholars at Harvard look to the guru with disciples appearance here. Of course, there are nuances to this. So Satchidananda, for example, Swami Satchidananda, who very famously chanted Om to open Woodstock, states, well, Patanjali gives some clues about people who get experiences through LSD or marijuana. So-called grass is an herb, is it not? Mushrooms could be considered herbs. So clearly warming up to some extent to the ways in which these might yield spiritual experiences. But I think the paradigm that carries the day is largely the one you see in Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which is the idea that ultimately yoga should replace the need for drugs. That there should be a transition perhaps from those experiences inspired by psychedelics to a more perhaps serious and sober practice through, in this case, his transcendental meditation. Well, there are a number of other gurus who play really critical, important roles, not only in sort of the larger culture of yoga, but also the development of psychedelic therapies. So for example, Swami Muktananda on the top right appearing with Ram Dass there in the lower right, was a very important guru from the early 1970s, I think, until he died in the early 90s. And very importantly, Stan and Christine Groff, who developed the holotropic breathwork system as a way to kind of keep their psychedelic therapy alive in the wake of the scheduling of LSD, developed that system in part out of Christine's experiences in Siddha Yoga, especially with the ways in which breathing could ignite a kind of psychedelic experience. And having done holotropic breathwork myself, I can say it is kind of impressive how that particular system will evoke somewhat profound states of consciousness. I think it's setting as well as, that kind of practice, but we can talk more about that later. Part of the reason I want to bring this up is because I think Groff's work is an undercurrent in psychedelic therapy that isn't really recognized for the impact it's had. I think the holotropic breathwork framework of facilitation is one of the key building blocks for the kind of the facilitator model, the non-interventionist kind of approach to facilitation that we see today, as well as the development of psychedelic ethics. Another reason I think it's important is that Muktananda's successor, Chidvilasananda, was the guru of Siddha Yoga when Roland Griffiths, perhaps the most important scientist in the development of the psychedelic renaissance, practiced in that lineage. And in an interview, he stated, I ended up having experiences in Siddha Yoga, having experiences with the teacher of Siddha Yoga. I became deeply intrigued with that whole area and then had a period of time in which that was the most interesting and important thing. It really became a primary focus of interest to me. In other words, his experience meditating in Siddha Yoga led him to shift from focusing on nicotine and caffeine and other substances to embracing a kind of, FDA approved approach to studying psychedelics. And so not only did that have an effect in terms of thinking about the ways that one might connect the practices of meditation with the use of psychedelics, but it also really helped bring this emphasis within psychedelic facilitation on these kind of complementary techniques. Well, I should say not only complementary techniques, but also having a kind of spiritual intelligence, much of which was informed by practices like mindfulness and yoga. That isn't to say everyone agrees. And so we've had some very prominent examples. For example, Swami Jaggi Vasudev, the Dalai Lama, and Swami Ramdev, three major living gurus, come out very strongly against the use of drugs and questioning the use of psychedelics. Likewise, Matthew Johnson, one of Griffith's former colleagues at the Hopkins program, came out with an article, Consciousness, Religion, and Gurus, implicitly, or if not explicitly, critiquing the model in which spiritual practices kind of infuse the psychedelic therapeutic space. Well, last but not least, this is my last slide, I promise. What do we see in the contemporary context? We see an explosion of integration of psychedelics, of psychoactive substances into the practice of yoga, whether that is cannabis-infused yoga practices of various sorts, traditions like the psychedelic Sangha, a very conscious and deliberate attempt to integrate psychedelics as a tool into meditative practice, or organizations like Lotus Vine Journeys, which joins together Buddhist meditative practice, postural yoga, and the use of ayahuasca into a kind of, again, synergistic kind of set of practices that aim to accelerate the process of spiritual and personal transformation. All right, so to return again, psychoactive substances have a long and storied history here that can be obscured if we just try to look for one thing. And that, in fact, there's a multiplicity of substances and practices that warrant our attention. And last but not least, modern and contemporary practice is infused and informed by these concepts and practices and conversations. All right, that's it. Thank you so much.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.